What's up?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this UK Values Alliance event about the office of the future. And I'm really excited about this because I've worked in this area for a number of years. And when I think about the traditional office model, I think it's a bit like the equivalent in telecoms of a hardwired landline. And I think over the last couple of years with COVID and the impact that that's had, it's kind of given us an opportunity to consider what a smartphone version might look like. And I wonder if we're going to grasp that opportunity. So this is an opportunity for us to hear from some specialists from different areas that I'm going to ask to introduce themselves shortly, together with some people that have a real strong interest in the topic of values. So it'll be fascinating to see how those two worlds come together in the discussion that we're going to have. So perhaps first off, I could ask the guests that we have today, so Perry, Chris, June and Lucy, to introduce yourselves, and in that order perhaps. So Perry.
Thank you very much, Alan. So good to be with you, everybody. So Perry Timms, I'm from Northamptonshire. My parents worked in a shoe factory, so you couldn't get more Northamptonian than that. I practice in the HR field on organisation design, change, performance, learning, talent, that kind of thing. I run a 16-person, fully remote, totally flexible, 4-day working week organisation. We're a certified B Corporation, climate positive and living wage employer. Yeah, we've got lots of viewpoints and thoughts about things like values and the role of the office. So yeah, delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Perry. Chris, you are on mute. Chris, we can't hear you.
You always forget to just unmute yourself, don't you? How do you follow that? My life started in a very small village in Ireland, and it led me to travel the world, to work with some remarkable brands, and to learn a great deal, and to understand the potency of the phrase people and place. Because when you say we want to talk today about the traditional office model, one of the thoughts I want to bring to this is, what do we mean by the office model? How do we see it? Because I've learned over the years, I finished my traditional world in 5-6 years ago, finishing with the BBC, and then I went down this portfolio life route. Haven't quite figured out vegetarianism or veganism yet, but very happy to explore new concepts and to spend more time hanging out with people in the HR world, and in that, that's a strange industry if you're coming from traditional real estate. Sadly, we are very introspective and very inward looking, so I was really breaking all the conventions. So I'm here to listen and to learn, and I'm intrigued by values, because values is something that is spoken a lot about in my former industry, but it's not understood.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. June.
Hi, so I'm originally from Singapore, and but spent like half of my life kind of working and going to school in the US first, and then now in the UK. I've been working, as a workplace strategist for the last 12 years now. Mostly for companies. So currently I'm in Cushman and Wakefield, which is a real estate company. Before that, I was at WeWork, and then before that, I was at AECOM. So been in the built environment, real estate type of industry. And I think for me, a lot of like what I am personally interested in is really helping clients, like, and the organizations that I work with, understand that the leverage that they actually have with their real estate, right, in two ways. Like, one, it can be used in a much better way to benefit like the communities around them, but also in a way that benefits like their own employees. I think for a very, very long time, and I like Chris, this is something you're probably so familiar with, real estate has just always been seen as a cost center and just like something to cut cost on. And that's so short-sighted, right? Because, you know, it's also one of the largest like physical canvas to show the world, to like engender the kind of like, you know, equity that you want to see, to bring about, you know, your values to life. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a building, but I think it needs to be, you know, cast out wider to what that working environment looks like. And again, it doesn't have to be in the building, but, you know, and it's a hard thing because this industry moves very slowly. You know, it's not like a piece of software or a service that you can just remodel and tweak, and then, you know, people build these things. So, you know, how do we help this industry become a lot more agile and values focused, I think would be my interest.
Great, thank you very much, June. And Lucy.
Hi everybody. So I'm originally from Manchester, but I moved to London in 2020 to begin my graduate job at Samsung, which I'm now still in. Kind of interestingly, I moved to London expecting to start going to the office, but I've only actually started doing that within the past kind of month. So I had about 18 months of completely working from home in my first kind of proper job. So I think it's quite a kind of interesting perspective that I've got as a kind of young person new to the office world, not being in the office. So it's kind of been a funny old road working from home, and how to kind of introduce yourself to a new business when you're not actually there in person. So yeah, I think it'll be a really interesting discussion around kind of my experience and how I think what many are calling the new normal is kind of my generation's just normal, because it's all we've ever really known. So yeah, excited to chat with everyone.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Now, I'm really looking forward to your perspective as well, because in the work that I do, it's about putting the customer experience at the center. And so, you know, we've got lots and lots of commentary from different stakeholders talking about the office and the future of the office. But actually most of them aren't the customer. And so it'll be great to get that perspective from yourself today. So to get us into this, and before we open up the discussion for everybody, let's have a round from our guests to answer this question. So how can a focus on values help the wide variety of stakeholders in navigating their way to creating a new model for office work? Perry, would you like to kick us off?
Absolutely. So it's an interesting concept, values, because I'm a very sort of purpose-led leaning individual. So I like to talk about organizations where that North Star thing is huge and it shapes literally everything that organization does. And often off that comes a set of values, which are the distilled sense of what that's all about. Sadly, I think values have become hijacked as rhetorical devices to stand in a space that makes you look virtuous. And so it's a shame, really. And it's great that you've got an organisation that's clearly trying to restore some sense of the virtue to what values really should be. Because they're statements of intent, really. They're saying this is how we'll be in pursuit of that purpose. And so when there's no process, when there's no decision-making parameters, you go, but what do our values tell us about what matters? And therefore, what should we do as a course of action? So I suppose if we apply that to an office scenario, we've got to ask that question, what matters about that physical space that is in line with what we're here to do, what we are aspiring to be as a corporate entity that does something good that the world needs and values. So I suppose really we've got to keep coming to that question. So if people go to an office, so like Lucy's experience will be really interesting here, does it match the expectation? Did it service your need? And was it obvious what values you have in the manifestation of the physical proximity, the flow of conversation and people, where decisions are made and so on? So if the answer to that is, I have no idea what's going on here, I couldn't pick up anything by osmosis, about what it means to be here. I'm not sure that built environment is serving your values at all, except perhaps to the contrary. Closed doors, little huddles, no what I'd call celebratory buzz. So I think it absolutely is, to June's point, like a manifestation of who you are. And if it doesn't answer that question, we've not questioned it before, but we certainly will now. So I guess that's my starting salvo.
Okay, thanks, Perry. So just distilling that down, and what it sounds like to me is that the point you're making is that it can be an anchor for the whole way that we look and deliver the office environment.
Yeah, like an artifact, a real representation of it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said.
Okay, Chris.
Building upon that, just to try and link it, I absolutely see the point Perry is making in that, having had the good fortune of working with the BBC, which is, a truly values-based organisation, and one of the key BBC values was great things happen when we work together. And that's manifested in so many ways. You look at the coverage of the war in Ukraine and how the various newscasters are being rostered through Kyiv and all that side of things. You wouldn't believe the logistical effort that's required to make all that happen and to maintain safety and everything. And it's a huge exercise, but much of it is built upon people believing that it's important to tell the truth. And, I've always had a very strong empathy for anything to do with values. In the context of your questioning, how do you tie in values with the built environment? And it'd be great to talk this through with everybody this afternoon, because I think we're in a dichotomy here, that the consumer of the building, as June quite rightly said, has only really started to recognize the power of harnessing an effective workplace to an effective workforce. The upheaval that's been brought about by the enforced lockdown, the experimental work from home sort of process, which came about due to lockdown, meant that more and more people can work anywhere, which I think brings about the final chapter in the law, or the principle of presenteeism. And all of this goes back to trust, which is a fundamental value. And people regard me in the corporate real estate world as somewhat of an outlier. I am not a conformist. I don't speak in the broad alignment to how certain organizations will want people to speak, because it's been a very good industry for a lot of people and makes a lot of money, and a lot of people have personal gain, which is a values point as well. So I was delighted to have the opportunity to participate in this, because real estate people do not speak enough about the construct that you guys know and love as values. All you have to do is look at your website. Most surveyors, property types, wouldn't be one bit interested in that, and shame on them. I'll stop with there.
And I couldn't have picked a better running order, could I, to have June following a comment from Chris like that?
Yeah, and okay, so I think like this whole thing about values, right? I don't think, before we talk about how values influence like your office model, I think for a lot of organizations that I've encountered, my question firstly would be like, are your values like just like a PR investor relations stint, or do you actually believe in it? And I've come across organizations where it is just prevalent, where you walk around and you can feel, like the camaraderie, you can feel that these people like believe in a common purpose, and it influences the way they treat you, they treat each other. And you can see it is so obvious, like how people speak to each other, like how inclusive they are. And you come across organizations where you're like, wait, one of your values is about like, being people centric, and, but like when you think about, then you walk into their offices and you're like, hey, but you put all of like your nice empty offices along the peripheral of, the floor plate, like that has like the best access to daylight. So, how can that possibly be true? So I think the first thing that when we work with organizations, it's always really about just drawing like I think it's just like a sense check, right? Like when people tell you that, like, I want to build this amazing workplace that does blah, 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 blah. I think like we always challenge them and try to understand, do you really mean it, or are you just talking? And if it is, fine, like, as a professional, like I would deliver like whatever project it is, to you, like professionally, but when you're working with an organization who truly believes in their values, it's a whole different ballgame. Like, the decisions that they make. And I think that's the most important point. Companies who really like believe in their values, they let those values drive their decisions. And those decisions then permeate through like every single thing that they think about, like when it comes to designing their offices, like, thinking about whether or not people work from home, how people work. And it starts from there. Values drive decisions, and then decisions permeate like how everybody experiences their organization on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, June. And Lucy?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's around how does the office and the kind of working model serve the values that people aren't currently having met through working from home. So an example from me personally would kind of be that sense of community and that sense of belonging. Is something that's quite hard to foster, I think, in a work from home environment. And so if you've got an office that really kind of meets that need, and encourages people to be more kind of communal, even just within the spaces. So in my office personally, we have a lot of kind of breakout areas, as they like to call them, and having those spaces where it really feels like it's more of a kind of casual place for people to collaborate. I think it's about kind of serving those values that, people haven't met through work from home. And kind of, so that's almost from the customer's perspective as an employee, but I think for the employer, it's around finding synergies between what their values are and what the employees want. So things like if the employer is really big on collaboration and wanting kind of more workflows between teams, and the employee themselves wants more creativity and they don't feel like they're getting that from work from home, how can the employer kind of think about their office model and provide more of a kind of creative workspace that allows people to really work together in that sense and meet those values that they were missing from work from home.
And when I think back on what each of the four of you have said, it kind of turns the question on its head, because it's like, why would you think that you can't enforce your values and have a successful office model? It just won't work unless you stand for what you say you stand for. So let's open this up now. Who would like to either make a comment or maybe ask a question of somebody based on what we've heard so far?
I'd like to ask the panel members what they think is the impact of the working from home model compared to the office model on the well-being of the employees in any organization. I mean, in many ways, because it's a very complex question, it seems to me. There's lots of ways in which it's asserted that working from home promotes well-being, and I think they're sort of obvious. There's less stress of traveling. You get to see your family more. You can go and walk the dog. You can go and go trampolining. Someone famously said when they're at the office, which is sorry, when they're at home, and they can't do it at the office. And there's but other ways in which well-being can be negatively impacted by working from home, and other ways in which working from office can be better for well-being. And of course, it depends on who you're talking about and what sort of organization you are. Are you talking about people who live on their own, who a lot of whom I know got very, very stressed working from home on their own day after day for it was okay for a few weeks, but after a few months, let alone a couple of years, there's a lot of great stress in that. And maybe you can work around that in the long run, but and also I've come across people who got quite anxious about their colleagues working from home as well. They when they saw them again, you know, in the last month or two, and at intervals, sort of about this time last year as well, last summer, when they saw them after a long time, they saw a lessening, an apparent lessening of their well-being. You know, lots of signs of stress and strain, and you can pick up on these sort of things in the office. But not necessarily when people are working from home. And again, people, if they're working from home, maybe have other people to look after them and look after their well-being. But some people do, some people don't. But these are things which, you know, sometimes a partner or family can't pick up upon because they don't know what's going on in your work life, and only your colleagues can pick up. So I'm just, the aspect of well-being, I haven't heard talked about all that much. Not, I don't mean this afternoon, but generally in this debate. I think it's an interesting question to ask. I don't know who would like to respond.
I would. I think from my perspective, it's been quite interesting because I've had such a long time working from home when it has been kind of one of my first official roles. Going back to the office, I think, has been quite kind of overwhelming in a sense that I'm not used to that environment. I'm not kind of used to presenting in person even. I'm very much used to presenting over Zoom. And so those kind of norms that everybody else would know are not norms to me. And I think so in that sense, it's been quite difficult to kind of adjust and adapt to what I know as kind of a normal working sense, which is being sat in the comfort of your own room in your own house and just kind of logging on when you're needed, to then suddenly being around an office full of people. I think just those kind of general social skills, you've almost like forgot what it's like to be in those situations. But I think on the other hand, it definitely does have a lot of benefits working from home for your well-being. I think being able to be flexible with your time and kind of prioritize things that are important for your kind of mental well-being has been huge. So I think it's kind of a bit of a mixed barrel for me.
Can I just like maybe I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of people and a lot of organizations is that this, whatever you want to call it, this hybrid working thing is still not intentionally designed by organizations yet, right? So this is a situation that we're in where we're all kind of going to the office pretty much like 4 or 5 days a week. Then the pandemic happened, and then we all kind of just started working from home. And then now that like things are kind of normal, what most organizations are doing are they're like, okay, like, you know, we kind of work from home, that kind of work. I think like, you know, people want to kind of come into the office a couple of times a week. Let's just kind of run with that. But the reason why like your health being would be impacted either in the office or at home is because there's not been an intentional thing. You know, like it's just a leftover remnants of, oh, it kind of worked. Let's just keep going until we make a decision around what to do. So many clients that we're working with today, like they are in a strategizing mode, they are in a like, you know, building business case mode, getting approvals from, you know, who knows who, you know, and I think the longer this is delayed, you're gonna start to see a lot of like negative, like just like, you know, impact, whether or not like to Lucy's point, like people just like not having been, you know, exposed to norms around like office working. So you come in the office, you feel like kind of weird. And there are people who are just not set up to work from home, and you know, but the companies still kind of expect them to be working from home a couple of days a week. And I think like we are just in a time now where companies should start making some pretty solid decisions and starting to roll out like support like either way.
Can I just make a? I do have a question, but I just want to kind of make a quick statement. Just having listened to what you've said, if that's okay, and that is, I mean, my interest is internal comms. You know, I work in an internal comms agency, and there's a big, obviously, employee experience is a very big part of that. Values is a very big important part, and a behavioural approach overall is becoming an incredibly important part of that. And I think when I think of values, and I think those statements earlier on, which are, you know, some of those statements around, you know, an expression of how we are and a manifestation in the office of what we stand for and all of that kind of thing. I think how organizations, to that point about, you know, hybrid working maybe being a leftover or perhaps like a transitionary phase before we get to something else. I think that how organizations address this situation, for example, how they address moving on from hybrid or moving to something that is more intentional, is in itself an expression of those values. You know, I think there's something about, rather than just trying to make our way through this and try to balance everything out, I think you can have a real statement of intent and make it clear that this is an expression of your values by doing something. Now, what that thing is, I don't know, but I think to my, you know, if you look behind me, you know, this is one of the things that we do. Is some of the things we do is we kind of help rebrand offices, or we help kind of like bring messaging and values to life. And I know that making an office a manifestation of your values is far more than that. It needs to go much deeper than that. But I'm just kind of thinking that really, I think you kind of, it's not just enough to, you kind of actually have to, in how you act, and I think in how you address a situation where everyone's walking around with their hands in the air, not quite sure what to do. I think that in itself can be a really powerful expression of your values. What that thing is, I don't know. Can I just quickly follow up with a question, because I'm mindful that I feel like the kid who's going to be slipping off in a minute, so I do apologise, because this is totally up my street, and I'm really enjoying what you guys have got to say. If you are either quite apart from, or it might be that the COVID situation we've been through is a trigger for this, how would you say values can successfully manifest in the workplace, above and beyond the fact that, you know, as an individual talking to another individual, hopefully our interaction, it expresses those values? You know, one way of doing it is to slap stuff on the wall, but to actually have some thought about it and be very careful about how you integrate it and what you say. But what are the other ways that you feel values can manifest, or are there examples that you can think of that really demonstrate that? And I'm opening this to anybody.
It's all about trust.
And choice, I'd add to that, Chris. Trust and choice.
Yeah, or choice and trust.
Whatever. Yeah, they're a kind of yin yang, right?
Yeah.
And when you're talking about choice, are you talking about your consultation with the people who are working with you?
Where you work on what you need to do in the way you need to do it. Yeah. And I think there's something about choices as well, about like exemplars of privilege, shall we say, and things like rank and stuff. So if you think you're so important, you've got to have a plush carpet and you're on a top floor, you might as well say, I don't really care about anybody in this place apart from where I am. It's so symbolic. And then some corporates might say, but if I'm stuck in the middle of the floor, it's too noisy, I can't do what I need to do. It's like, welcome to everybody else's world. Seriously, I think it's that strong, Damon. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Wow. And I think you would see, you know, what HR professionals have been mulling about for years. I think we'll actually now start to see the final chapter of bureaucratic and hierarchical thinking. And, you know, that's where, you know, the Values Alliance, you guys have got to really step up and really push forward, because, you know, we're all basically clueless. Anyone that calls themselves an expert at the moment, they're lying, because we're all trying to figure out problems using 20th century thinking, 20th century principles for the third decade of the 21st century, having seen and living through a complete and utter paradigm shift. And we have to consider everything from Charles's considerations around wellness to Lucy trying to figure out what is the norm. Sadly, Lucy, there won't be a norm, because we won't be going back to normal, regardless of how many people hanker after that, because of the huge amount of behavioral and attitudinal changes that have taken place in society across the world all at the same time. And that's going to be nothing like the economic turmoil that Brexit, that COVID, and this war in Europe will bring about, which would force a lot of enterprises to fundamentally reconsider themselves. And that then gives us a huge opportunity, I suggest, to correct many of the wrongs that have emerged over the last 60 years.
I'd add to that, Chris. Mic drop, totally. I'd add to that the word normal and new normal is not helpful. Think about ordinary and extraordinary. Lucy. That's the way. What makes this place extraordinary? What can I see and feel and do to be extraordinary? If you talk about normals, that's too low a bar. Ordinary and extraordinary, I think, is the language to use.
But I think the other thing to say is about some of the norms that are broken down, which is in some of the stuff that I'm looking at, which is to do with the sort of work-life balance, the sort of work you, and the sort of non-work you. And certainly the younger generation, that is so much less marked. And for lots of people in the old days, and I use the old days, you know, they put on a suit or they put work clothes on. And it's interesting that Lewins, the shirt maker, have just gone bankrupt for the second or the third time because no one is wearing the sort of smart gear anymore. And I think that changes around authenticity as well, which is a big part of values. And whether when you go through traditionally office door, you change in a subtle way in terms of how you present yourself. And when you're working from home, that's much more subtle. So I think the difference between a work you and a play you is one of the things that is up for grabs at the moment. And I really feel that employers need to do a lot more research to really understand that shift. And they don't fully understand those changes because they're so subtle they won't see them. Other than, Lucy, what you said is that when you went back to the office, it's in certain aspects it felt like kind of really weird because, you know, for example, people might be watching you work, which is quite freaky if you're just used to being, you know, in your study working on your own, and then suddenly, you know, you can easily get paranoid and stuff. Why is that person looking at me? You know, I'm working. So I think, and I think one of the most helpful things you can do in terms of the return to the office is what I do in terms of the research that I do, which is when I'm onto a call center that I know they're working from home, I ask them what the experience for them is like working from home. And the variety of answers is staggering. So this is not a situation where you can, you know, because we're not forced into offices, we've become much less of a herd animal. And humans naturally are herd animals. We like our communities, but it's dissipated the herd aspect because we're all in these individual pens, and it has quite a significant impact on your approach to work and also the needs that you have. So I'm saying more research. I think this is complicated, but it's I agree that we are at the dawn of a new age where this sort of Victorian control model has just been smashed. So very exciting.
But the other thing, Neil, for your research, whatever, is that we're seeing the death of the one-size-fits-all mentality. And the challenge, you know, and Perry, you've been to the forefront of this for years in terms of a much more humanistic approach to strategic HR rather than what I would call the mechanical. And then for June's perspective, you know, I mean, as a workplace strategist in your career, you've been accustomed to managing by the numbers, headcounts, densities, rentable square feet. All of those remain relevant, but their relevance is significantly diluted because they're all factors of efficiency. And we now ought to be looking and focusing more on factors of effectiveness, including well-being, sustainability, brand proposition. I think the asset test for any successful organization, large or small, going forward, will for them to be seen to be the employer of choice. Because Lucy, you will change your career on many multiples of times compared to what, say, Perry and I might have done in terms of long, lengthy, you know, 5, 10, 15 year or lifelong career paths. Simply not going to happen. And leaders are now recognizing, oh my God, convening the workforce in a variety of workplaces is mission critical. And sadly, June, for us that come from the workplace strategy world, we're now an endangered species. The world of strategic HR, those that have the capability and the desire to step up, are becoming more and more important. and the place bit is diluting.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, like, I think, like, when listening to Neil and Perry, right, I'm very, very mindful whenever we have conversations like this about the future office and, blah, 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 that we are actually talking about a very small group of people. People who work in offices in this country is a very small part of the workforce. It's not the majority, right? And this is where I come back again to, like, the values thing, right? Because what are the values of an organization? This is an opportunity to rethink how you, like, go out to the world, like, because and not even to the world, like, let's think about organizations that have a very diverse staff population in all sorts of roles and functions. So you have, like, what organizations would typically call, like, fee earners or, like, profit centers, and then you have your cost centers, call centers, engagement centers, and all of these very diverse, like, groups of people can exist within an organization. Now, it is 100% a privilege. I mean, like, the stuff that we're talking about, like, being authentic, like, bringing a whole staff to work, these are first world problems, right? A lot of people are just working because they need a job and they need the money. And where I think, like, you would see organizations who are truly, truly value, like, driven is when you watch those companies make the decision. So, like, companies who have engagement centers, call centers, like, how are they also then extending, like, whatever choice it is, whatever autonomy it is that they're giving their, R&D functions? Like, are they giving the same privileges to their call center staff, their administrative staff, their back office staff? And I think when you start to get into that, and then, it becomes, like, a much more substantial conversation. And to your point, Chris, like, I think if we continue to consider and consult, like, our clients on just, like, the office, like, we shouldn't even be doing that anymore, especially, like, when, so many organizations now, like, D&I, diversity inclusion, like, it's a part of their values, right? And how are you really doing that? Like, how are organizations really doing that? I mean, and we're guilty of this too, right? Like, all these, like, shiny buildings in the city of London, you are a stone's throw away from one of the poorest bars in London. So people can walk past your buildings. Can they come into your buildings? Like, what are we doing? Like, we are creating, like, such a delineation, and, like, and so I think that when we start to talk about values, I think this is where we need to help organizations that we work with, like, real estate functions, like HR functions, like, it's really around, like, you're not going to, the reality is that, like, a lot of people are tied into leases or they own buildings. And I'm not saying that people should come back to the office or anything, but, like, you have these assets anyway, and that is essentially what they are, assets. So how are you going to use them for the better good of not just the people that you value in your organization, but your entire organization and the communities around you? Because these assets, these buildings, your leases, they're not just going to disappear tomorrow or next year.
Okay, can I just quickly just sorry, you carry on, June. You were just finishing a point.
I was going to say, like, you made a really good point, Dave. And, like, in this moment right now in time, what decisions, like, organizations make, their response to the last 2 years, their decisions around how they should carry on is critical. That is the true reflection of their values.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And just one thing I was just thinking about, and I was just picking up on the kind of illustration you made there was when you were talking about some of these huge edifices being within a stone's throw of some kind of really some quite kind of poor and deprived communities. If I think about values, and I think about them in the context of internal comms over the last 15 years or so, I kind of see a lot of the same kind of tropes cropping up, and an expression of values is often tied in with corporate social responsibility. It will be tied in with work we're doing, with whether it's fundraising or going out and making a scent garden in a local home for people with a range of challenges. What popped up in my head when you were talking about within a stone's throw of a deprived community is there's something, if we're talking about values are by definition, they're a human attribute. And there's something about being human in terms of being in place. If we talk about places that are important to us, like home, the location and the community around. So when I think about it, sorry, I'm getting to my point. When I think about values, I'm thinking, well, maybe we should be thinking about work locations as more than just the place that you go to work. We should be thinking about them as saying something about that organization and where it's rooted. You know, these aren't just kind of farms for employees. These are, you know, these are physical landmarks. And if we're talking about communities, we should be talking about the communities in context of those physical landmarks, I think. And I think there's something about that. It's something very grounded about it. Doesn't fit very well with the idea of people who are working very far away in very different situations. But I think there is something to be said about that, and potentially to recognize that having a physical asset like an office that is a manifestation of your values, it should kind of radiate out from there in the physical location. That makes sense. So I'm going to have to dash. I've got a train to catch, but thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to watching the rest of this. Have a good chat, guys.
Cheers, Damon.
All the best.
Damon's just raised a point there, I think, that is important, because there is so much focus on the place of work. And yet the only reason we need the place of work is for the people. And I remember going to a facilities management industry event a number of years ago, and the guest speaker said, you know, I've looked for definitions about what facilities management is. And he read out this long, convoluting definition of what it is. And he said, I really didn't understand that. My definition of it is, if it wasn't for us, you'd be working in a field. That was his definition of corporate real estate and facilities management. And I think that's far more accurate, because it acknowledges that the only reason you need the building is for the people. So the question for the office model of the future, I think, is what do the people need to do? And what do we want to help them to do? And that should guide the conversation. And June, to your point about long leases and all the rest of it, I think that's a kind of sticky phase that we need to go through, that shouldn't be a distraction. Because ultimately, if we allow it to be, it will stop us. It will just reinforce what you were saying earlier about the snail's pace of the industry.
100%.
But Alan, the challenge is looking at this from a system point of view. You referred to facility management. Facility management is one of the three tribes of the real estate world. 3 different tribes, 3 different value systems, 3 different languages, 3 different socioeconomic orientation. The system itself is utterly fragmented in that the focus is overall on the build and the creation of the asset. The facilities managers are the people, actually, to June's point, who had to go to work because they had to service these buildings and they had to run the risk of infection and everything during the pandemic. They're also the folk who've been squeezed by the never-ending spiral downwards in FM in terms of cost efficiency.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you look at it, there's some really challenging values-based dilemmas in that part of our industry. But the challenge is everything is fragmented. There are too many vested interests. There are too many people not living to any sort of values, sadly, which means the whole thing was never going to move. And then along came COVID, because the big thing that the industry hasn't quite got its head around yet, many people are acting like ostriches with heads in their sand, is that the fundamental behavioral shifts, the nature of work, office work by and large, but it's not insignificant, has changed.
Yeah.
And that means demand and consumption and occupancy is changing. So take, for example, Manhattan. There's a nice neutral example for this. 40% of the office tower blocks in Manhattan will no longer be office buildings by the end of this decade for a number of reasons. That's massive change.
It is.
I think Britain will be a bit slower, but I think you will see the emergence of central social districts rather than central business districts, areas which are more focused on the human. And we have to stop one thing, and this is another challenge for you and the Values Alliance. is we've got to stop creating places for people who are called the haves to the exclusion of the have-nots. There are too many already gated communities in all sorts of ways and forms. The Bloomberg headquarters cost £1 billion, for example. You know, you look at all of these things. You look at London South Bank. You look at what's happening in Leeds. You look at Manchester, etc. There's all the creation of these high-value places. No wonder we have the social disconnect we have, sadly. And that's where the real estate industry has to stand up. We've made average returns of 8 to 9% compound over the last 20 years. And people try and peddle the fact that we can't upset this because it'll impact our pensions. Well, pension fund investment in real estate is probably no more than 6% of their total. So, you know, that doesn't, real estate's got to put its house in order, and it has to move forward to a new office model, one that's values based.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just conscious of time, and I'm just going to ask Bryony, I know you're a great listener, and I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts that you'd like to share with us at this stage.
I think it's very interesting that we're talking about this now, because it feels very soon to be talking about it in many respects, because it is just emerging, what, you know, the impact of all the things that have happened. But it definitely does, for me, though these things have already been mentioned, but it's this appreciation of difference. So many people will have found different ways of working, more challenging, less challenging, and I think it's the you know, that's what employers and workplaces have really got to focus on, the difference. I love working from home, actually, but I know that my daughter, for instance, likes a bit of both, because there's a friend of mine who lives locally, and that she's got a job, you know, in a place that's 2 hours away, but she only has to go in every couple of weeks, and she looks at that time as being a time when she's doing all of that social stuff, because there's, you know, so yeah, there's the difference, and that hierarchical, that equality, that, you know, that all of that kind of is in that big mixing pot. And I think the other one thing that keeps coming through, so I mean, there are many places that I work who haven't got the opportunity to change the actual building that they're living in. I mean, you can put more, you know, have things available to make people comfortable and whatever. But the big thing really is the way that we communicate with each other, and actually communication when you're looking at difference, and, you know, those skills are really, really important. And some people will have embraced them better than others, but in places, certainly virtually, where I'm online in a certain way, you have an immense amount of connection. So yeah, communication actually seems like a really big one that we should focus on, and that whole difference and equality. You know, how can we make sure that everyone benefits from this change?
Okay, so as we draw to a close, then, what I'd like you to imagine is that tomorrow morning you receive a call, and it's from a corporate real estate services professional working for a large corporate organization. And they say this to you. They say, I hear you were on a great call yesterday talking about the role that values could play in the development of the new office working model. What one tip would you give me based on what you heard and discussed last night? So, Charles, what would your answer be?
Golly, I'd be overwhelmed if why would they be calling me anyway, really? I think I don't have anything to do with that. No, to take your question seriously, I think I'd have to say that it's quite obvious that this is an incredibly complex subject, and thinking hasn't really been done on it. Research certainly hasn't been done on it. There's lots of evidence floating around, clearly. We've had 2 years of evidence of what happens when we're not able to go into offices, but we have very little evidence about what happens when we can truly work in a hybrid fashion. There are people who've done it. I've actually worked most of my life in a fairly hybrid fashion in offices and floating around, usually not working from home, they're working off a laptop or whatever, going around the world. But I think actually I'd say we need to do a hell of a lot of research before we can answer the question.
Okay, thanks, Charles. And Lucy?
I think it's about viewing your employees as your customers and really recognizing that there has been such a kind of shift in people's values since the pandemic. People place a lot more emphasis, I think, on kind of seeing friends and family and things like that. So having that flexibility, I think, would be the main thing, and thinking about sort of what does the office model bring for people that they're not currently having in the work from home model. What kind of drives them in and feels like it's filling a gap where their needs are kind of not met from home. Yeah, that would be my advice.
Thank you, Lucy. June?
I think it would be like, really try to figure out, like Mr. Organization, like what your values are, and if they are truly, if they truly resonate throughout your organization. And if they do, then, let that determine your priorities. And then, let those values drive your decision. Like, don't start with the answer of what you think that future office model would be, and then try to like, shoehorn your values into it. Like, just do it from like the purest sense possible.
Great, thank you, June. Neil, what about you?
I would simply say start with a brand new piece of paper, a blank sheet of paper, and talk to some startups in terms of what their value set is going forward. I think you need to, the key to winning here is to ignore the historical baggage.
Great, thanks, Neil. Bryony?
Yeah, look at it. This is a huge opportunity. It feels like bigger than the workplace. It feels like bigger than where we're working. This is a major shift in people's lives. Work is such a big part of our lives. So there's, it is complex, and yeah, it feels much bigger than a workplace thing. So yeah, look at it as an opportunity.
Perry?
I'd refer to the Edelman Trust Barometer year on year, which is saying that people value work as a sanctuary from all that chaos and madness out there. So I would urge people to start thinking from a perspective of actually creating a place of wellness, because I don't think the previous office was a place of wellness, and we need it to be, and therefore we will eradicate corporate gentrification of areas.
Thank you, Perry. Chris?
I think it's on the theme of fresh perspectives, which Neil and Perry, I think it's about one phrase, which is a quote from Leonardo da Vinci: recognize that everything connects to everything else, and understand the importance of people in place and how the system works and how values can have a very valuable contribution to shaping that.
Thanks, Chris. And I think mine is a combination of what a number of you have touched on, because I think that it is about having the confidence and courage to create the next whatever, making that driven by your values explicitly and everywhere. So everything is joined up and aligned, rather than in silos and doing their own thing and kind of colliding against each other. So, wow, I was expecting a good conversation today, but this hour has just gone by like a breeze, and it's been fabulous. And it's making me wonder whether this actually could be the beginning of conversations about this topic, rather than just a conversation. So if any of you were interested to explore that, I think us at UK Values Alliance certainly would be interested to explore it with you. So thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you all. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks,
Bye.
Alan.
Bye.